Now, the last rights of the left are often delivered, and I would say rather hubristically. The Labour left has had its ups and it's had its downs. Personally, I was born into a family, I suppose, of the Labour left. I used to work for John McDonnell when I left university in 2005 for 4 years, worked for him and left-wing MPs in the Socialist Campaign Group, the grouping of left-wing MPs. For many reasons, clearly, I was extremely interested and fascinated by this brilliant new book by Andy Beckett called The Searchers, 5 Rebels, Their Dream of a Different Britain and Their Many Enemies. And this focuses on these, I suppose, iconic left Labour figures, Ken Livingstone, who ran the Greater London Council in the 1980s and became a kind of thorn in the side of Thatcherism before it was abolished. And then when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, again became a thorn in the side, this time with a new Labour Prime Minister as Mayor of London. And then his career, well, kind of spun out of control, I would say. John McDonnell obviously became the Shadow Chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn and was the head of finance under Ken Livingstone in the 1980s in London. Diane Abbott, of course, the first black female politician elected in Britain, a trailblazer, who recently suffered an attempt to publicly humiliate and destroy her at the hands of Starmerism. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn, who became leader of the Labour Party and has now won his campaign to become the independent MP for Islington North after being purged by Starmer. Andy, what a brilliant book. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yeah, I guess, just firstly, the Labour left. I'm just kind of interested what that kind of whole tradition, because and how it kind of evolves and shifts. Nye Bevan was the leader, I suppose, back originally, he was the founder of what we'd regard as the modern Labour left in lots of ways, wasn't he? Founder of the National Health Service, resigned from the government over the introduction of NHS charging during the Korean War. What would you describe the kind of general? And then Tony Benn. Tony Benn. How could we forget? You booked looking at Tony Benn from the 80s onwards the 70s onwards became the figurehead of the Labour left, the Bennites. He was a cabinet minister who moved leftwards with age, which is fascinating. But I just want to hear what's your general thoughts of what the Labour left is, its role in democracy in the Labour Party.
First of all, I'm not a member of the party. I never have been. I have voted for Labour on various occasions. But I guess when I'm feeling optimistic, I feel like Labour needs to be a broad church. And sometimes when it is that, say during the 45 to 1951 government or during Corbyn's leadership, that's a very powerful thing. So I guess part of me thinks it should be a broad church, but I'm aware that the Labour right can be very aggressive and very sectarian and is often kind of busy trying to expunge the bits to the left of it from the party, which is something obviously we've seen under Keir Starmer. So when I'm feeling pessimistic, I feel Labour is a very limited kind of vehicle for the sort of centre-left that doesn't really tolerate left-wing members in it. And when I'm feeling optimistic, I feel like it's a broader thing. But in my book, I'm kind of focusing on people on the left since the 60s, because I suppose the part of it that has interested me the most, the part of the left that interested me the most, is what I'd see as the kind of quite forward-looking, sort of very socially liberal part, the part that's quite interested in technology and in kind of bottom-up kind of socialism. And so the book kind of starts in 68, which is obviously the kind of big revolutionary year in the 60s, because that's when a lot of the people I write about were first radicalized. So I'm not doing down previous sort of iterations of the Labour left. They're incredibly important. But I kind of thought I'd focus on the part that I was most interested in and seemed kind of most contemporary. I think bits of the Labour left are incredibly important, but they're more about preserving things.
Yes.
And that needs to be done. But there also needs to be work that's about, what's modern society like? How do we respond to that? What does digital technology mean for politics? That's something Benn was writing about in 1970. So it's that kind of forward-looking side that drew me the most, I suppose.
Let's talk about Tony Benn. Obviously, like lots of people, I suppose my generation of the left had a huge influence on me and my politics. I was very lucky to get to know him in the later stages of his life, do events with him not long before he died. And he was a fascinating figure because he came from this long political family, very privileged family. And he is something of an interesting, not exception, there were other examples, but he moved left with age. He was a kind of basically a career politician You know, someone who associated with the right of the Labour Party, didn't speak out against the Vietnam War, voted for immigration, very restrictive immigration controls under the Labour governments, but then was politicised in office. I mean, what do you think happened there? It's quite interesting how 68 onwards, this man became, you know, the experience of government, being in government is what made him left-wing, which is not actually normally what you'd expect.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, he was Minister of Technology in the 60s, which is a very kind of late 60s kind of Harold Wilson type job. And I think, well, I know he encountered a lot of sort of obstruction from civil servants. He was very disappointed by how a lot of British companies dealt with attempts by the government to modernize the economy. So that kind of radicalized him. He tried being a minister, you know, working extremely hard, trying to do sort of technocratic 60s things, and they didn't really work. And so he developed a kind of critique of the economy and how it worked with, you know, shareholders getting too much of, you know, too many dividends and not enough investment. That it's, you know, he kind of decided that post-war social democracy, which you and I might think had some pretty good aspects, but he felt it was limited. He kind of felt to some extent it had failed. And there's a kind of shared analysis there with Margaret Thatcher in a way. They're both kind of radicals thinking post-war social democracy wasn't enough. And obviously Benn's solution was to try and go further left. But this kind of change happens to him around 68. Also because in that year, he became very interested in the sort of social movements in sort of feminism and Black power and gay rights and so on. And he quite quickly worked out these social movements are massively important on their own terms, but also they offer opportunities for the left. And some of his project was, you know, reuniting more traditional left-wing Labour politics with these new social movements. And yeah, he's pretty ahead of his time to be doing that in 68. He's writing things about identity politics and its potential, you know, which might have been written a couple of years ago. And he's writing these, you know, 50, 60 years ago. So I think that's very interesting. I'd have to what you said about him is before he radicalized, he was always pretty good on racism. He supported the campaign against the segregation of bus drivers in Bristol in his constituency. And he was also pretty good on decolonisation. So there were little aspects of his personality, even when he was in the mainstream, that showed he was thinking a bit differently from some other Labour ministers.
He went from Anthony Wedgwood Benn to Tony Benn. And democracy, I think this is always quite interesting. Democracy was always at the core of how he saw socialism. He saw socialism as the logical, you know, extension of the democratization of everything, basically, which is what led him to Euroscepticism. But also, you know, that point you make about dissenting from the post-war consensus. So the nationalised industries, Thatcher's critique was, well, how do the people actually have a stake in this? If we privatise them, they'll all have shares in them. That's real popular ownership. Obviously, Tony Benn didn't agree with that, but he agreed it was top-down and undemocratic, and you should have democratic ownership. And that democracy always became a big part of the Labour left, didn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And that's something that Ben and the other people written about in the book, I think, had in common, that it's a more bottom-up socialism. In some ways, it's quite skeptical about the state and what the state can achieve. It has a kind of flavour of anarchism in it as well. Not a dominant flavour, but that's in there. So yeah, one of the frustrations, I think, is that all the people I write about were often vilified in the right-wing press as kind of closet or overt Stalinists and authoritarians. And they were not perfect figures by any means, but they certainly weren't that. They were pretty hostile to a kind of Soviet-style top-down, and even pretty hostile to the kind of Whitehall dominating post-war top-down thing that Britain had. That they wanted something different, which was more decentralized and, yeah, more in tune with social movements. You know, Ben looked at social movements and thought, well, they don't operate in a hierarchical way, and there's things to learn from that.
And if we're doing now what have the Labour left ever done for us? What was interesting in the 1980s is all the figures you were kind of discussing here. Obviously, Tony Benn, as you mentioned before his time, talking about what I suppose became known as identity politics in some ways, but Ken Livingstone, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn were rebelling in a way against an old left, which was seen as very white and often just only about class and the kind of economic reductionism, I suppose. And what they tried to do is marry that with the struggles against racism, against the feminist movements, the gay rights movements. So just interested in that kind of era. I mean, if we look at the struggle for the black sections in the Labour Party, which obviously the likes of Dan Abbott were fundamentally, you know, at the core of. But in the GLC in London, under Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell, where they were demonised as the loony left because they supported what was just generally known as gay rights at the time, including giving grants to groups of LGBTQ people. And that was a kind of really interesting trailblazing thing, wasn't it? Because actually, at the time, if people look at the social attitude survey, anti-gay attitudes were extremely strong and pervasive in British society. So it was seen as quite a brave thing to do, which the Labour leadership itself did not like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the GLC, John McDonnell was running the finances, as you mentioned, and he was pretty young then, in the late 20s, and he worked out that in local government legislation, if you read it carefully, there were all these ways that the GLC could get money for things that weren't really defined. So they used this Tory legislation from the Heath government to find these new revenue streams. And then they gave the money, as you're saying, to kind of minority groups. And that was a very, at the time, radical thing to do, and was incredibly unpopular in most of the media. And one thing that's fascinating is if you look at GLC kind of pamphlets and so on now, which at the time were pretty well produced, good graphic design, quite modern looking. They look like something you might get from an HR department nowadays or from a primary school. It's all about diversity essentially being a good thing and being a kind of, something almost we should all accept. And so you see the sort of, I guess I would argue, the massive kind of almost invisible victory that the sort of Livingston GLC identity politics has won, because clearly lots of people in Britain are still not social liberals, but there are a hell of a lot more social liberals, I think, now than there were, as you're suggesting, in 1981 when Livingston took over the GLC. So they were very clever at sort of changing how politics worked in that regard, and also thinking about where the voters were, that Livingston was smart, and he realised in London, which is obviously where the GLC were operating, you could build a left politics out of coalitions. There was no longer necessarily a huge industrial white working class, but there was a big working class in London that was multiracial, that wasn't working in industry, bus drivers or, people working in back offices, in little estate agents, those sort of people. And, you could build a coalition out of all these minorities within London that was very powerful. And now, again, for a lot of left politicians, that would be pretty standard practice. But at the time, that was a big break with, as you say, a more sort of white working class industrial view of what the left could be politically.
What do you think? I mean, looking back at the 80s and the way, the high point of the Labour left was in 1981 when Tony Benn challenged Dennis Healey for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party and very narrowly was defeated. And that's a different timeline altogether. You got the breakaway, the Social Democrats, obviously the right of the Labour Party. And then in 1983, you get a landslide defeat at the hands of the Conservatives. Tony Benn loses his seat in Bristol, redrawn boundaries, but nonetheless. But I mean, do you think, looking back, was it kind of, if we look around the world, there's a general shift, wasn't there, to the right? And then you got the end of the Cold War, which was spun as the end of free market capitalism anyway. What do you think? Was it kind of like that was just, basically, the Labour left was always going to get clobbered in that period? By 1988, Tony Benn stands against Neil Kinnock for the leadership and gets a landslide defeat. Which Kinnock uses as a mandate to shift Labour left to more to the right. What do you think? Was it just kind of like, whatever the Labour left did, was it not necessarily their strategic incompetence? Was it just that's the trend of the time?
I think to some extent it was the trend of the time. I think that, particularly by the mid-80s, capitalism, the Thatcherite version in Britain, was working quite well for not probably a majority of the population, but a large minority. A lot of young people doing quite well under that form of capitalism. So if you look at the Tory vote amongst young people in the mid-80s, it's extraordinarily high compared to what it would be now. So I think that kind of the economic and social model appeared to be working for enough voters, and that was really problematic for the left, I think, from the sort of 84 onwards. But I think there's sort of tactical mistakes as well. Benn lost his seat in the 83 election because he basically stood in a seat where Labour might lose, and he was eased out of, shall we say, the seat where they might have won in Bristol through real chicanery by the Labour right. So Benn was maybe a bit too proud to leave Bristol and go and find a safer seat. And had he been around as an MP in 83 after Labour lost the election, maybe he could have stood for the leadership then in better circumstances. But instead, he was out of Parliament for a key period. So maybe that was a mistake on his part. But I think mostly I'd say, Britain was kind of changing at that point in ways that weren't favourable to the left. And I think it's very different from now, where, as we'll probably get onto, the left have been very marginalised inside Labour. But within the electorate, a lot of left ideas are pretty popular. And I don't think that was the same. That wasn't true in the mid-80s.
It's really interesting, that, isn't it? In terms of, for example, the point you make about generational politics, because there's a cliche which is not actually empirically rooted, which is about the younger inevitably on the left, and then they move rightwards with age. But in 1983, Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives had won a 9-point lead amongst 18 to 24-year-olds over Labour. There was often a kind of narrative at the time, as like the left were kind of like, it was like this preserve of an older tribe, and younger people were more enamored with the kind of I guess the populist iteration of neoliberalism, which was like the individual will be freed from the state and the collective and collectivism. And people hadn't gone through how free market capitalism wasn't going to give them that freedom. They got these short-term bungs like right to buy, which led to a long-term disaster. Yeah, that's the difference, isn't it? Generation left is what we call generation left. I wish, that actually meant all young people were ideological socialists. It doesn't work like that. But what it means is people have lived through the insecurity of neoliberalism. But back then, it was easy, the zeitgeist was easy to be captured by the right, wasn't it? And that's not the same as today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think also it's to do with what stage of life you're at. I mean, the very first article I think I wrote for The Guardian, many decades ago, was about how people vote by age. And I wrote this piece, I don't know, in the 90s at some point. And it was interesting that, people in their 20s were a bit to the right of people in their 30s, because in your 20s, I'm generalizing here, but if you've got a job, you may be not benefiting that much from the state, or not in overt ways. You're probably not on benefits. You're not using the health service much. You don't have kids probably at school. So there's a period in your life where you can kind of think, do we really need the state that much? And then when you get a bit older, you might think, oh, yeah, we do actually a lot. So I think there's a bit of that going on. And as you say, the sort of status quo appeared to be working all right, not for all young people at all in this period in the 80s, but for quite a lot of young people in the South. I was born in 69, so I remember being a teenager in the sort of mid 80s, living in the south of England. My dad was in the army, and we were not wealthy, but we were living in various towns in southern England. And you kind of thought, for young people, I was not a Tory, but I didn't think this is not working at all in the way that you would do if you were a young person now. It seemed like fairly prosperous. These sort of towns in the home counties where I was living, and the sense of the status quo having failed, and of there being almost sort of generational warfare against the young, that wasn't so strong then. I think the Thatcher government, although very socially conservative, was not as overt in its kind of dislike of young people as the Conservatives have become subsequently.
Yeah, which is really interesting because, again, looking at 1983, 42% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted Conservative, just 33% voted Labour. Now, 40 years on, they're in their early 60s, and obviously they're voting still quite a lot the Conservative Party. A lot of them voted Labour under Blair, but they weren't obviously necessarily particularly progressive. They never were. Yeah. But the statistics now suggest, the Financial Times shows millennials are the first generation not to shift right with age. Yeah. I'm just wondering, in 1997, let's just jump over that because the Labour left just were, excised then. Interesting, John McDonnell was an exception in that in 1992 he tried to stand as a Labour MP, but was defeated by a very right-wing Conservative MP. And then in 1997, he triumphed. But the Labour left at that time were just seen as completely... the left was seen as irrelevant, wasn't it? There wasn't really a coherent left at all. That was when I was a teenager, and the left just didn't seem to be a thing in society.
Absolutely. There's an interview that Tony Blair gave to the political editor of the Evening Standard at some point, late 90s, early noughties, which I've put in the book, where he says, oh, you don't have to worry about Jeremy Corbyn ever becoming leader. Ho, 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 and how they both laughed at that remark. Yeah, I think that's right. There was, but I think kind of things began to change a bit, maybe at the very end of the 20th century, in the sense of those big kind of anti-capitalist demonstrations in London and Genoa and Seattle, and I went on some of those, and I remember thinking, oh, the people on these marches are a bit younger than I'm used to seeing on marches. And then obviously once we get closer to the wars that Blair was involved in, I don't know if you've pick this up, but I really felt, oh God, the people on these marches, they're quite racially diverse. This is a kind of changing coalition that's on the streets now. And I think in retrospect, there was something going on there. And there was also the real interest in the kind of radical left regimes in South America, particularly Chavez in Venezuela. So I think there's kind of something building a bit in late.
Yeah, I would say just looking at I suppose I was different in that I'm what's known as a red diaper baby in the US. My parents were Trotskyists. My dad was a full-time organizer for the militant in the for 10 years until me and my sister were born during the miners' strike, and they didn't have any money. But what the way I would see what you think, obviously, about this is you'd say you got the anti-capitalist movement of the late 90s, then you get 9/11.
Yeah.
A lot of that then metamorphosizes or goes over to the anti-war movement, particularly obviously Iraq, and then a lot of that energy there then fuses as well afterwards. It gets stuff added onto it with austerity, the student movement of 2010.
Yeah,
I remember being at the UCL Occupation. I met a lot of the people who became. I met Ash Sarkar there. She was 18 years old. A lot of people who became Navarra. They ended up. That all was preconditions for Corbynism, wasn't it? Like that, you got anti-globalization to anti-war. So that energy had to go somewhere, and it found a home in 2015.
Yeah. And all those different movements, they're all different pieces of a kind of critique, aren't they, of the status quo, to do with foreign policy, to do with the economic system, to do with the state becoming more and more kind of punitive and mean. So they're kind of bits all fitted together. And I think that's definitely true, that was kind of building up in ways that people didn't pick up at the time. When Chavez came to London, when Livingston was mayor.
I went to see him.
Yeah, well, you tell me, but there was an interesting mix of kind of quite old lefties and much younger people were both groups were there to see Chavez. And in retrospect, that was to some extent what the Corbyn coalition was going to be. Maybe the missing part was the middle-aged people, but there were a lot of, there was a cross-class, cross-age coalition that was quite excited by Chavez coming. And I think that was quite significant. There was definitely something kind of afoot.
I remember it well. He, all I say is he went on a lot.
Yeah.
But what was, I still remember this moment. It was Sid. He described the Saudi dictator as his friend, and the rooms, and he went, it was very funny. It was like a real faux pas at the time. But yeah, you're right. It was Gen X. Gen X basically were always missing. Gen X were always often the kind of ardent Blairite centrists, were they? Politically speaking.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's my generation, that I think, when Blair was first elected, I had no illusions, but I was still kind of pleased. And I thought they did some things in the Blair's first term that were quite good, the minimum wage and devolution and so on. But it really did feel that Blairism moved to the right quite rapidly after winning in 2001 in terms of its foreign policy and other things, its sort of discourse around immigration and everything. So I think I was definitely by sort of 2001, 2002 thinking there's got to be more to left of centre politics than this. And I think Blairism went stale, didn't it, in all kinds of ways after the first 3 or 4 years. And so that probably pushed some people who were sort of, if you like, on the soft left, further leftwards, because they thought, hang on, Blair is not one of us. He's a kind of centrist or maybe even a centre-right politician.
Yeah, I think that's right, because you got the Blairism of the kind of, I mean, in the first part, despite Tory spending plans for 2 years, you did get a lot of public investment undermined by the likes of private finance initiative. But in 1997, you had Frank Dobson, who was a health secretary, and he, they campaigned to end the internal market of the NHS. Yeah, exactly. They had the minimum wage, which was something. They had windfall tax for, they did actually do things which I suppose contrast. I mean, that's the thing is, I'm jumping around, but actually 1997 compared to now is actually Britain is in a much worse state now.
Yeah.
Partly because there was economic growth and rising living standards at the time because of a financial bubble that went pop. This time there isn't, but the offer is so much more slimmer, and actually then closer to the Blairism that is 2005 onwards, which is all about marketization, privatization, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think there's more social conservatism in what Starmer's offering. I mean, I think there were aspects of what Blair was offering that were socially quite liberal, like civil partnerships. And one of the things that fascinates me about Livingston and what he was offering at the GLC was that I think in some ways he was almost offering before its time a sort of left-wing version of New Labour. It was a sort of less workerist, more socially liberal, quite well-branded kind of politics. And I think one of the reasons why Livingston was seen as such a threat and why the Blairites tried so hard to stop him becoming mayor in 2000 was because they kind of recognised that he couldn't just be dismissed as some sort of traditionalist kind of dinosaur, that there was something, some of the marketing insights and sort of gimmicks that the GLC used were then used by New Labour. So there's an interesting there's almost like two different versions of where Labour could have gone. And clearly we got Blairism, and clearly Livingston's mayoralty in the end was not super radical, less radical than the GLC, I think. But there are two streams that are both rejecting kind of traditional Labourism. And I think the sort of GLC side of it needs to be sort of rehabilitated, because otherwise the Labour right say, oh no, we're the modern ones and you're just all the traditionalists. And of course, that's not true. The Labour left was in lots of ways more modern, more kind of attuned to society and how it was changing than the Blairites were. But I think the Blairites did initially have a little bit of social liberalism going on that Starmer doesn't have to the same extent, I think.
Yeah, and you saw that because people who used to be in the Labour left, like Margaret Beckett, for example. I mean, she wasn't core to the New Labour project, I know, but she was still high up, and people who came up through, you know, people like Paul Boateng, elected as a black Labour MP in 1987 alongside Dan Abbott and the rest. They obviously had an impact. That strand had an impact with the New Labour interpretation. Harriet Harman, there's another one, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Patricia Hewitt.
Yeah.
In terms of like just shifting around a bit in terms of just Corbyn's leadership, because without just going over that whole period, which was obviously which is widely discussed. Well, I just got to think now, just kind of go now and forwards. A lot of people would look at Corbyn's leadership and go, well, that's that. You know, what's the legacy there then? I mean, you know, 2017, that election's been erased. You know, when Labour got 40% of the vote, yes, we know Labour didn't win the election, but that was the first time Labour put on seats. If it wasn't there wasn't a factional lens there, and they would just go, well, that's something to learn from. If that's the first time we put on seats in 20 years, then clearly 40% of the vote, right direction, clearly. But that's just erased from history. It's like Stalin and those photos where the person's erased, and you know that's 2017. And then 2019, you know, they use that to just be like, that's what they really thought would always be Corbynism, 2019. And that's what must again be like 1983, hung around the necks of the Labour left ever. You try this, look what happens. Yeah. Is that what you want?
Yeah.
But I mean, it hasn't. I'm just interested, kind of think. What do you think the legacy, firstly, of kind of, do you think of Corbynism is?
I think one of the legacies that's not talked about enough maybe is just the experience of being part of the movement. That there were so many people involved in Corbynism, and those people, they had, you know, in some ways quite life-changing experiences for several years. And so I think part of the kind of centrist critique of Corbynism is so sort of patronizing towards people that got involved, because it's kind of saying you got involved, it was a total dead end. In fact, it was actually malign and anti-Semitic and all the rest of it. So it kind of just dismisses that very powerful experience that people had. And a lot of those people are not in frontline politics now, but that's going to sit in their heads. And that's almost, I think, like a latent thing for the future. People have tasted quite an expansive, quite interesting Labour leadership, and they won't forget that, I think. I remember going to some Corbyn rallies at the end of the 2019 campaign where it was clear Labour would lose. But you'd look around the rally and you'd think, you know, a lot of the most interesting, you know, in some ways most connected people in whatever city you were in were all at that rally. And there's quite a lot of cultural capital, I think, still. So I think that's one legacy. I mean, I suppose another thing is just the example of politics being made as big as possible. You know, so much of Starmerism, like Blairism, is about saying politics can only be about a few things, and all these other things, we can't go there because, you know, they're bad for Labour or they're too risky, or, you know, we can't talk about having a Liberal Home Secretary, for example, like Diane Abbott wanted to be. But in the Corbyn era, it was like politics can encompass almost anything. It was like, you know, we're going to have a critique of Britain in a really broad way, and we're going to try and address all these things. And that could have led, as it did, to kind of policy overload, but it was quite exciting. I found that quite exciting. I thought, oh my God, all these things which are not allowed to debate are now being debated all the time at Labour conference or whatever. So I think that's a very powerful legacy. And I think, you know, look at the vote shares, like you've intimated, even in 2019, Labour got, what, 750,000 more votes than they did just last week. So even the idea that it was like a total dead end and hardly anyone voted for it, I'd kind of push back against that a bit, because Corbynism, even in its worst period, got a pretty big vote. And a lot of people who are maybe quite Brexity or in parts of Britain that are less privileged voted for Corbyn in 2017, and quite a lot did in 2019 as well. So there's the participation, there's the expansion of ideas, there's the kind of sense that politics can encompass kind of almost anything. I think that's still there. And I think some of the aggression, I'd argue, of the kind of centrists about Corbynism and the desire to purge the party is because they really want to shut this down. You know, this whole thing has to be shut down, put back in its box very quickly, because otherwise it's a dangerous example. I think there's almost projection in how centrists have behaved towards the left since Starmer became leader, that the centrists are obsessed by the idea of the left are sectarians, but actually the people who've been really sectarian in a very effective but also quite nasty way are the right. And I think there's an anxiety in that kind of aggressive project. It's like, let's just erase Corbynism, because if we don't, that's a really alarming kind of precedent that's been set, perhaps for some future Labour leader, because I'd argue, if you look at the British Social Attitude Survey, the public are in quite a left of centre mood about the economy and about inequality in a way they weren't 15 years ago.
I think I mean, for example, what you're alluding to partly is a kind of march through the institutions.
Yeah.
And I'll say a lot of those people who got involved were my personal friends, people I got to know very well, people I knew before, but what I make is they're extremely talented people. They're bright, they're full of ideas, they're very capable. And they've ended up, a lot of them ending up in lots of different organizations, NGOs, all the rest of it. But they've taken that experience with them. And I suppose the other point, and again, this is something you talk about obviously in the book and in this conversation, is a lot of the left sometimes, and this is where we ended up, I suppose, after the 80s, the left was in a very defensive posture. Stop the cuts, stop privatisation, stop the war, stop things. But Corbynism, what that did is stimulate ideas about what does a different sort of society look like in the 21st century. And it strikes me that, the Labour right were in exile for a very long time and had a lot of time to come up with their own ideas and thought and policies, but they didn't really come up with anything. And I think partly because they don't really have anything in the era in which we live. And actually, I suppose what makes them kind of insecure is they've won by, I would say, default, because, Keir Starmer's he's the least popular opposition leader to ever win an election by a big margin. But those ideas, you have very capable people who haven't shifted to the right. I would just make that clear. But those ideas as well, there's still the kind of vision thing which inspires people.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think particularly some of the thinking going on that John McDonnell encouraged around, how the economy could be democratized, or, things like, promoting the 4-day week, which is, as we're now seeing, is becoming a bigger thing for the kind of public sector and the private sector. A lot of that thinking about the economy, the kind of fresh thinking on the economy, which the left hadn't really done for quite a long time, that happened when John was Shadow Chancellor. That's very powerful. That stuff's all sitting around. A lot of those pamphlets and things, they're all quite well written by bright people. This is very optimistic, but it's possible that, the GLC's kind of ideas about identity and diversity were there, and then they were squashed when the GLC was abolished. And possibly some of the thinking that went on during the Corbyn leadership about the economy, those ideas are still there. And so just like GLC ideas were later picked up again and have become, much more influential again, it's possible that I think some of the economic thinking is going to be picked up by all kinds of people, not even necessarily people on the left, because as you're alluding to, the Labour right hasn't really come up with many new ideas, I'd argue, for a long time, since probably the early noughties. That's 20 years. And even, this is very optimistic, but even if Starmer possibly, is faced with a real emergency in the public services in a year or two, if he's thinking, where am I going to get some more revenue from? The Labour right hasn't come up with many answers to that question. So I think the Corbyn leadership laid down quite a lot of ideas that were quite modern, that are available for kind of future use. That's what I would say. And the GLC example shows us that radical ideas that are kind of squashed in a rather sort of crude way don't go away. Then if they've not really been discredited, then they're around for future use. And I could see that happening again, because a lot of people under 40, even people who are much older than that, don't think the economic status quo works. And so they are open to the idea that things could be done differently in a way they maybe weren't during the Blair era. I think that's,
as a geriatric millennial, I grew up when younger people were seen as very apathetic, very politically disengaged.
Yeah.
That's just not true anymore. Younger people are far more politicized than when I was growing up. And I think just illustrative of that, and why this is different from, say, 1997, is, for a start, Labour won 43.2% of the vote in 1997. They've won 10 points less in this election. As you know, they've only won a slightly bigger vote share than in 2019 and a lot lower vote share than 2017. And actually, in absolute votes, they've won fewer votes than 2019, and the population's bigger than then. I would just note that. But what's different, I think, is really interesting is, within the Labour Party, they've just gone destroy the left, incinerate it, all the rest of it. But if you look, what's different from 1997, you didn't have a kind of clearly left of Labour constituency that was making an impression.
Yeah.
You just, the Labour Party was dominant. And then, so, I mean, as an example of that, the Green Party, they won 4 seats. But what I think is just as interesting is they came second in a lot of places without any campaigning. So they've come second in 47 seats on a left of Labour programme. And just actually, I'm in Islington South, Islington North. Jeremy Corbyn won in Islington North. And the reason I'm going to make this comparison is in my constituency, the Greens went from 4.2% last time to 17.5% in second place with no campaigning meaningfully. In Islington North, the Greens only got 5.4%. The point I'm making is, if you just comparing those, a lot of the kind of like left, there's a leftist constituency in lots of constituencies. Again, in Huddersfield, they came second with a very strong, over a quarter of the vote. In Bristol, in all those seats around Bristol Central, they've done really well. They got 30% in one. You know, the Greens think they could take those seats next time with campaigning. And that's before, you know, the point I'm making is there's already left of Labour disillusionment. They're not even in power yet. They've already, Tony Blair had to be in power for years before, for example, Muslim voters start to turn against Labour. That's already happened. So largely, we've seen independents, left-wing independents. So it's actually very different. There was a kind of progressive sensibility amongst, I would say, younger people, plus lots of minority voters don't like Starmerism. Starmer's approval rating's 50 points lower than Blair was in 1997 amongst minority Brits. So there is a coalition the left can still build on, whether or not it's in the Labour Party or not. Yeah,
there definitely is. I mean, with the first Gaza march that I went on, one of the kind of quite early ones that was a bit disorganized, I turned up at Trafalgar Square and there were a huge number of people. And first of all, I was struck by the scale of it. But also I looked around and I thought, the people who are here, often young, kind of non-white London, I was thinking, if you're a kind of Starmer electoral strategist, this is a kind of scary sight, because there's a hell of a lot of people here who are young, who are the voters that you're not really appealing to. And they're all here to a degree protesting against your stance on this issue. And it wasn't just like a load of old lefties who you could kind of say, who cares about them? It felt very, very different. And even in Corbyn's campaign for independent, I mean, I'm not in his seat, but I'm in the next door seat, and going backwards and forwards to the tube station, the people out canvassing for Jeremy Corbyn, I thought, oh, this is a load of quite young, quite engaged, quite interesting, I'm sounding patronising, but it felt like there was an energy there and a modernity even to Corbyn's local campaign without many resources that would feel, I think, ominous for Labour, because they can't just say, as they might have said about Benn in the late 80s, oh, he's a heroic figure of the left, but he's basically becoming old-fashioned and irrelevant. You can't really say that now, I think, about these left movements. And I think, I mean, I don't know what you think, Owen, but I think a lot of people that voted for kind of what we might crudely call kind of Gaza independent candidates were voting on a sort of anti-imperialist kind of line as well. It's not just about Gaza, it's about a lot of other interventions by the West, or by the West's kind of clients, if you like. Yeah, actually, a kind of Starmerite pollster, more in common, made the point that it would be a mistake to say, well, this is just Gaza, and when that's not salient, this will vanish. They were saying this is like, for example, in the Red Wall, where Brexit becomes a moment where it's a trigger point, and then a loyalty is broken because it signals wider issues. I mean, on that, I'm just interested in what you think in terms of what happens next, because I mean, I personally think Starmerism is defined by hubris, partly because we talked about New Labour. Whatever we think of New Labour, I think the people who founded New Labour were really substantial people, actually. Yeah. They were very, very formidable politicians. They were charismatic. They had hinterlands. They came out of this kind of weirdly Eurocommunism, Marxism today, this kind of idea of post-Fordism, that the economy had changed irrevocably and we had to adapt to that. And New Labour kind of responded to that in its own way. This lot they're not very good, is what I'm trying to say. They're kind of like middle managers and student politicians who hate the left and, like ice picking the left a lot in a kind of quite one-dimensional way. If you meet them, they're not charmers, I'll be honest. But what I mean is that, it's like, well, yeah, you won because the Tories destroyed themselves more comprehensively than any government in democratic history. And you got 33.7% of the vote. And then some of them are like, well, no, that shows the genius of Labour. But it's like, because they didn't pile up votes where they didn't need them. I don't think they built a Jenga tower landslide on purpose, which could just topple over. So I'm just interested. The Labour left, if I were them, I wouldn't go for Labour left MPs now. I'd be worried about that. I think they could win as independents or join the Greens and boost the Greens' chances. Governments don't normally get more popular in power. So maybe you look at this and think, well,
I mean, France shows it's up for grabs. The far right, we can see how that could happen here. What do you think? What do you think next for the left? If you were Starmer's team, would you be like, job done, we kicked them out, oh well, Jeremy's won his seat, bit of green disillusionment, that'll disappear? Or do you think actually this is very different from what happened in the past? There's actually, the left exists for structural reasons in society, and those structural reasons haven't gotten away. They're likely to get bigger.
I mean, you would hope, well, maybe not hope, but perhaps more astute people advising Starmer would think what you've just said. They'd think there's this chunk of the population that we're going to need some of that vote, especially next time, when we've made some quite unpopular decisions in our first term. But I wonder whether the sort of sectarian impulse will still drive them. That they'll think these people, these people are the enemy, and we don't have to get their votes, we don't have to include them in our coalition. But yeah, I think a kind of broad church version of Labour would be electorally much more effective than the current version, and I think the vote share shows that. And I think, to go back to what you said about New Labour, I think it's a really good point that New Labour at the beginning, I was at university with some of the people who became New Labour ministers, and I remember at the time thinking, your idea that kind of capitalism has won and that workers and bosses are on the same side and things like that they would say in the kind of student bar, I remember thinking, are you sure? I'm not sure that's quite right. But they were people who had thought quite hard about what Britain was like and how politics might reflect that. And I think with Starmer, I'd be interested to hear what you think, but I feel like they've thought quite hard about certain demographics in the Red Wall and about what life is like for them. And they've tried to sort of tailor their vote offer to that. But I don't think the Starmer strategists are very interested in most of Britain in a sort of how are people living, what's the texture of their lives kind of way. I think there's a sort of studied kind of incuriosity about, what's it like to live in a multiracial city? What's it like to be, an Uber driver? How is that working class experience for you compared to the old working class experience? I don't think they're super interested.
No.
And I remember reading a book by one of Starmer's advisors, who's no longer working for him, but who is very important. And the book was all about the modern working class, and it basically didn't mention Thatcherism at all, except to praise Thatcher for having offered the right to buy. And
this is Claire Ainsley, his former policy director.
Exactly. And I thought, it's quite a good book, but I thought there's a studied kind of incuriosity here. It's like any analysis of what is life for the working class in Britain now has to acknowledge that Thatcherism changed Britain a lot for everybody. And yet it was just avoiding that. It was kind of saying working class life has become more atomized and difficult, kind of partly because of middle class liberals. And you're kind of thinking, well, middle class liberals have probably got some blame here, but really Thatcher breaking the trade unions and changing working conditions profoundly for a huge number of people is a much bigger factor. So I kind of think there's a thing in Starmerism that maybe weakens it, that apart from one or two ministers, I think most of the people I've encountered, you feel like they're not super interested in like the texture of life. And in this book and in other books that I've written, I think political movements get very powerful once they don't have to exactly follow how society is, but they have to reflect that. Thatcherism reflected changes that were happening in Britain in the 70s to do with individualism and materialism. Blairism reflected a kind of, degree of contentment with capitalism that was around in the mid-90s, and yet a need for greater social liberalism. I think Starmerism feels a bit disconnected from where a lot of people are at in terms of how they're living. And that doesn't feel like a strong basis for a kind of, for a long ascendancy. I don't think that that's in.
I think you're right. I mean, with the kind of the way they looked at the so-called Red Wall, it was this kind of like, we're going on safari, I thought, quite patronizing view of people who live there, kind of, and let's fly some, fly the flag and talk about Keir Starmer being a toolmaker and about the dignity of work. But actually, I mean, the polling shows that Labour went backwards in deprived communities at this election. They went up in affluent in affluent communities backwards. But I think that finally, I think this will be the undoing, is that they don't. I mean, Morgan McSweeney, was his chief of staff, election coordinator, who ran Liz Kendall's campaign, the Blairite candidate in 2015, got 4.5%, and obviously decided, well, we need to dupe these people in order to win. But he told Nick Forbes, the former leader of Newcastle Council, Nick Forbes said about Morgan McSweeney, he doesn't have room for compromise with the hard left. He thinks they need to be eradicated from the party because they are so dangerous. I think that's the issue. I think they have this kind of factional vindictiveness. I think they really hate the left. I think they really think the left is like morally despicable. and needs to be just not accommodated. And I think the problem is they'll have this kind of patronising. What are voters in, when people don't like migrants, we need to understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
But with voters who defect, who are kind of who regard Starmerism as reactionary, and obviously they're never going to understand these people. They will never try to understand these people, and actually they think they're bad and mad. I think that's what they think. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Deborah Mattinson, who obviously is another key person as a sort of advisor and sort of focus group organizer and so on for Starmer, she wrote a book called Beyond the Red Wall, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And I read that book, and one thing that's fascinating is that she doesn't interview anyone, as far as I remember, who's younger. It's all about Red Wall voters who are basically over 50. Now, clearly those voters are important, but there's there's an incuriosity. What do young people think who are living in the so-called Red Wall? Maybe their politics are not quite so socially conservative. Who knows? She doesn't ask them. And so it's a very limited kind of engagement with the sort of reality, people's attitudes and how their lived experience. It's like certain types of experiences seems authentic, essentially, if you're, fairly conservative person. But if you're a bit more radical, that doesn't count somehow. And, I understand propaganda is important in politics. Starmer needed to present himself for electoral reasons in a certain way, but it's one thing to propaganda, but your strategy underneath has to reflect actually the reality. And I wonder about whether there's much of that going on. And I think the aggression, as you say, of the Labour right is just really striking. I mean, in my book, I tell the story of how Benn was, basically sort of destroyed in Bristol by a campaign to kind of essentially deselect him and then make sure he stood for the wrong seat. And the people running that, they really wanted Labour to do as badly as possible in the 83 election because they wanted to destroy the left.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me that the left are always accused of being disloyal and purist and kind of really wanting purity rather than the Labour government. And that is sometimes true, but I think it's much more common that the Labour right think, as they showed during Corbyn's leadership, frankly, if we have to destroy the Labour leadership and get slaughtered in the election, that's worth it because we'll have control of the party. And I don't know. I mean, I kind of knew this, but until I researched the book, when you actually dig down into the stories, the sort of celebrating when Benn loses his seat is kind of quite eye-opening. And I think we've seen some of that, haven't we, with Faiza Shaheen and so on, that some of Starmer's people are probably quite happy to lose that seat because it's
they were. Ed Ball said that on national television, the former Shadow Chancellor. He said they'd be happy with that.
I mean, somebody said to me, a Labour person said to me that Faiza Shaheen had been deselected as a decapitation strategy, as they put it, because they thought in the long term she would be a threat because she was a kind of impressive young left candidate, and it was 100%. About that. And that's pretty gross, I think.
That's what they thought. They thought she might be Britain's AOC. They thought, she's got a great backstory. She's charismatic, telegenic, clever, relatable. They didn't like that. They looked at it and thought, when people get annoyed with us, they could coalesce around her, which is why I think she would be an excellent leader of the left for the reasons I agree with them. But you're right. I just generally, the people on the Labour right are some of the most vindictive, nasty people I've met, not just in politics, but in life. Just really unpleasant people, horrible people. And I have to say, you know what, I've never felt scared before of the people running the country, because my fear was, and one of the reasons I left the Labour Party was, these are really authoritarian people. New Labour always had a very authoritarian streak, but these people hate the left with a passion, and I would not put it past them to use the state machinery in whatever way they can to just do over the left in whatever way they can. I think they're really nasty, scary people. That's my own view, but we'll see.
I think also there's a kind of thing that I think some of that is a particular Labour culture, which has been there through its history, of people thinking, for Labour to have as much power as possible, the left has to be destroyed. There's always been people thinking that. But I think there's also something about the bigger kind of institutional sort of animus against the left, which I guess my book gets into in the media and in, the City of London and in a lot of, other powerful places, that, what is it about these people that, I've written about and that, you've allied with, who are basically kind of left social democrats, really. They're pro-democracy, they're social liberals, they don't want a revolution, at least not initially. So why have they made people so angry, and why have they had to be destroyed? And I think that's terribly revealing about the limits of what's kind of seen as acceptable politics in Britain. And I think it's quite depressing in a way, because none of these people, from Benn to Corbyn to Pfizer Sheen, are proposing something that's really going to turn Britain upside down. And yet a lot of people are like, no, you've gone too far. You have to be destroyed. And I think that, so in a way, my book it's about the left, but it's kind of, what does the anger against the left tell us about, if you like, other bits of politics, you know, other centers of power? And I think those things it tells us are quite kind of alarming, actually. Because really, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the election in 2017 or 2019, you know, if you're a British capitalist, you would have had probably slightly higher taxes, a bit more regulation, but I think you would have ended up with a much more stable government than you got under Boris Johnson. And for me, one of the great tragedies of the 2019 election was that Labour didn't make the choice between, you know, a very risky Boris Johnson and in some ways quite risky Jeremy Corbyn. It all became about the risk of Corbyn, and Labour didn't manage to make a lot of centrist voters think Johnson is a bigger risk than Corbyn. I don't know what you think, but I think that was a real kind of failure of the campaign.
Yeah, maybe. I just think to be honest, I mean, whatever people think, you know, I merged into one, but a lot of people just on Brexit. That's, you know, it wasn't about stability. They wanted Brexit to happen. That wasn't a particularly stable offering. So it was, and a hardcore form. And it's a brilliant book, honestly. It's so important as well. I think it's just such an important book in terms of understanding what happens next. Obviously, it's these 5 left Labour figures, Tony Benn, and then the 4 who came after them. And I think it'll be interesting. What's interesting is just how so many younger people have been politicized.
Yeah.
The people who were directly involved, but just the kind of impact of this, I think, will be felt for generations. Sometimes I think of, when I'm being optimistic, a kind of left take on, in 1964, the right-wing Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater was defeated in a landslide. And sometimes people on the American right say, Barry Goldwater won in 1964. It just took 16 years to count the votes, because, of course, Ronald Reagan, his big cheerleader, ended up winning 16 years later and transformed the United States in ways which obviously more accorded with the philosophy of Barry Goldwater. So, you know, I sometimes, that's what I hope. And I think the Labour left and the ideas it's had have had a big impact in terms of struggling, not least for minority rights, but I think the basis of how democracy and capitalism are on a collision course, I think, is something which will increasingly be, I think, very apparent to people. So make sure you get a copy, everyone, of The Searchers, 5 Rebels, Their Dream of a Different Britain and Their Met Any Enemies by Andy Beckett. Do leave your comments, press like, subscribe. But Andy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been great. Thanks, Owen. Cheers.